Frank snapped the alien's brittle neck with a casual flick, watching its exoskeleton crumple. Just another bug that got in his way during the galactic wars. As he strode into the Galactic Council chambers on the capital world, the insectoid Pandronians shrank back, their compound eyes narrowing. The veteran human marine scanned the room, noting the mix of suspicion and disdain. Frank towered over them all, armor still caked with gore. He had no time to clean up between missions. There were too many heads to crack. "Commander Simmons, a mission of vital importance," the ancient Zithorian leader rasped from his podium. "The mad Pandronian warlord Zorgax has stolen a prototype weapon. It will destroy entire systems. You must infiltrate his Xandros stronghold, retrieve the device, terminate Zorgax with extreme prejudice." A spindly Pandronian youth shot up from the benches, waving its forelegs. "Objection. This assignment to a human?" It clicked indignantly. "We were taught humans are weak and primitive, unfit for such tasks. I, Yaxer, am a superior Galactic Academy graduate. I should go instead." The Zithorian fixed Yaxer with a withering glare. Silence. "You understand nothing, hatchling. Only Simmons has any hope of stopping Zorgax. If he fails, we all perish." Frank smirked over his shoulder at the young alien. "Watch and learn, kid, watch and learn." As he marched to the shuttle bay, Frank's jaw tightened. The galaxy's fate rested on his shoulders. This wasn't his first impossible mission, and it damn well wouldn't be his last. The Odyssey's airlock hissed as Frank marched up the ramp, his heavy boots clanging against the metal. The ship was his pride and joy, a lean, mean, ass-kicking machine. He'd won it in a high-stakes poker game against a drunken Zithorian admiral. Best hand he'd ever played. Frank was about to seal the hatch when he heard the scrabbling of insectoid feet. He whirled around, hand dropping to his blaster, but it was just Yaxer scurrying aboard with a duffel bag slung over his carapace. Yaxer drew himself up to his full height, which was still a head shorter than Frank. "I have orders from the Council to join your mission. They thought it would be educational for me to observe your methods." "Observe my ass," Frank snorted. "I don't need some snot-nosed brat getting underfoot. This ain't a field trip." "I'll have you know I was valedictorian of my infiltration and demolitions class," Yaxer said stiffly. "I'm more than capable of handling myself." The kid had a quad. Frank had to give him that. He stared Yaxer down for a long moment, then jerked his head toward the cockpit. "Fine. But you play by my rules, get me? No whining, no second-guessing, and definitely no touching any shiny buttons. You're here to watch and learn, nothing else." "I understand completely," Yaxer said, his mandibles quivering with badly suppressed excitement as he scuttled after Frank. Frank powered up the Odyssey's engines, the deck plates trembling as the fusion reactors spun to life. The ship knifed up through the atmosphere and into the star-flecked void. Once they hit open space, Frank kicked in the hyperdrives. The stars smeared into streaks of light as the ship hurtled faster than physics should allow. "Listen up, kid," Frank called over his shoulder as he worked the controls. "In a few hours we'll be dropping into the Xandros system, a few light minutes out from Zorgax's fortress. We'll take a cloaked shuttle in, slip past their perimeter sensors. Intel says the Doomsday gizmo is locked up tight in a vault deep inside the compound." Yaxer pulled up a holographic schematic of the fortress, studying it with all four compound eyes. "Look, these ventilation tunnels run right past the vault level. Why don't we access them here, at this service junction? Avoid the main corridors entirely." Frank glanced at the glowing blue diagram, his brows rising in grudging approval. The kid had a good eye for this sort of work. Maybe this bug wouldn't be completely useless after all. "Not bad, rookie. Might keep you around if we manage to pull this off." Frank turned back to the viewport, watching the smears of hyperspace unspool around them. "Now strap in and shut up. I need to focus, and you need to stay the hell out of my way until I tell you otherwise." Yaxer obediently buckled himself into the co-pilot's acceleration couch, but Frank could practically hear the gears in the kid's head spinning, probably trying to prove he belonged on this mission. Well, they'd see about that soon enough. Xandros was coming up fast, and with it a date with a planet-cracking bomb and the bug-eyed bastard who'd stolen it. Frank and Yaksa crept through the dimly lit corridors, their boots barely making a sound on the metal floor. The stronghold was a maze of twisting passageways and dead ends, but Frank navigated them with a soldier's instinct, Yaksa close on his heels. Suddenly the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from around the corner. Frank held up a fist, signaling Yaksa to stop. He peered around the bend, his eyes narrowing. A squad of Pandronian guards marched towards them, their exoskeletons glinting in the low light, blasters held at the ready. Frank turned to Yaksa, his voice low. "Take cover, I'll handle this." Yaksa ducked behind a support beam as Frank stepped out into the open. The guards shouted in alarm, raising their weapons. Frank moved like lightning, dodging the first volley of blaster fire and closing the distance in a heartbeat. He slammed into the lead guard, driving his fist into the alien's midsection. The Pandronian doubled over, its exoskeleton cracking under the force of the blow. Frank spun, his elbow connecting with another guard's head, sending it sprawling. Blaster bolts sizzled past him as he danced between the guards, his movements a blur. He grabbed a guard's arm, twisting it behind its back until the exoskeleton snapped. The guard howled in pain, dropping its weapon. Frank snatched up the fallen blaster and fired, taking down 2 more guards with precise shots. He tossed the weapon aside and lunged at the remaining Pandronians, his hands and feet striking with devastating force. In a matter of seconds, it was over. The guards lay unconscious at Frank's feet, their exoskeletons shattered. Yaksa emerged from cover, his compound eyes wide with shock. "How did you do that?" the young Pandronian stammered. "I thought humans were physically weaker than Pandronians." Frank chuckled, brushing dust from his armor. "We may not have your exoskeletons or razor-sharp claws, but humans have spent centuries perfecting the art of hand-to-hand combat. Never underestimate the power of a well-trained human soldier." Yaksa nodded, a new respect dawning in his eyes. They pressed on, delving deeper into the stronghold. Frank's senses were on high alert, his body coiled and ready for action. At last they reached a massive door, its surface gleaming with a strange metallic sheen. Yaksa ran his claws over the door, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. "This is it," he said, "but the door is reinforced with a tritonium alloy. My studies suggest it would take a military-grade plasma cannon to breach it." Frank grinned, reaching into a pouch on his belt. He pulled out a small spherical device, its surface etched with intricate patterns. "Or we could use this," he said, placing the device on the door. He tapped a sequence into the device's control panel, and it hummed to life, emitting a pulsing blue light. The door shuddered, its surface rippling like water. Frank stepped back, his muscles tensed. With a sharp crack, the door shattered, its fragments tumbling to the ground. They stepped through the breach into a cavernous chamber. In the center of the room, suspended in a crackling energy field, was a pulsing orb of dark energy, the prototype doomsday device. "Careful," Frank warned, his voice tight. "One wrong move and we could unleash Armageddon." They approached the device, Yaksa's eyes gleaming with fascination. Suddenly a deep, menacing laugh echoed through the vault. Frank spun, his hand dropping to his blaster. Zorgax, the rogue Pandronian warlord, stepped from the shadows, a dozen elite guards at his back. The warlord's exoskeleton was adorned with jagged spikes, his compound eyes glinting with malice. Well, what do we have here?" Zorgax sneered, drawing a plasma saber from his belt. The blade hummed to life, casting an eerie red glow over the warlord's features. "A human and a traitor, come to steal my prize." Zorgax leveled the saber at Frank, his mandibles twisting into a cruel smile. "You've made your last mistake, interlopers." Frank stepped between Yaksa and the encroaching threats, his body coiled, ready to strike. "Yaksa, when I give the signal, grab the device and run. I'll handle Zorgax." Yaksa hesitated, mandibles twitching, torn between following the order and standing his ground. After a beat, he gave a curt nod. Zorgax advanced, plasma saber humming, his guards fanning out to encircle them. Frank launched himself at the warlord, zigzagging through the barrage of blaster bolts. He collided with Zorgax, their weapons clashing in a storm of plasma and sparks, the air sizzling with each strike. As the titans clashed, Yaksa darted for the containment field, his claws flying over the controls. The field dropped, and he snatched the pulsing orb, stowing it in a reinforced capsule. He spun to make his escape, and froze. Frank and Zorgax were a whirlwind of violence, the human's blade locked against the warlord's saber. Yaksa watched in horror as Zorgax's blade grazed Frank's shoulder, the plasma searing through armor. Mandibles clenched, Yaksa drew his own weapon and charged into the brawl. Zorgax reeled back, shocked by the youth's sudden assault. Yaksa pressed the advantage, his vibroblade a silver blur as he drove the warlord back. Frank saw his opening. He drove his boot into Zorgax's midsection with crushing force, doubling the warlord over. Now! Yaksa broke away, sprinting for the vault door, the doomsday device clutched to his chest. Frank was a step behind, laying down covering fire as they fled. Alarms shrieked to life, a deafening cacophony that shook the walls. Pandronian guards boiled out of every corridor, plasma raining down around the fleeing pair. They skidded around a corner, the drainage tunnel in sight. A phalanx of guards blocked their path, weapons leveled. Frank never slowed. His hand dipped to his belt, snagging a flash grenade. He hurled it at the guard's feet and dove for the tunnel. The world exploded in searing white light. The guards howled, clawing at their dazzled eyes. Frank and Yaksa hit the tunnel at a sprint, scrambling through the dank passage on all fours. They burst from the grate into the sweltering jungle, sucking in lungfuls of thick, humid air. Zorgax's enraged roar echoed from the stronghold, promising retribution. "We've got the device," Frank panted. "Now let's get the hell out of here before Zorgax unleashes the full might of his army." They plunged into the undergrowth, vines lashing at their faces, thorns tearing at their armor. In the distance, the Odyssey's cloaked form shimmered into view, a welcome sight. Yaksa's hearts hammered against his exoskeleton, his mind reeling. They had done it. They had the key to the galaxy's salvation. But as Zorgax's vengeful howls faded behind them, he knew their mission was far from over. The warlord would unleash every soldier, every ship, every weapon at his disposal to reclaim his prize, and he would show no mercy to those who stood in his way. The shuttle's ramp lowered as they approached, beckoning them into its armored embrace. Frank bounded up the ramp, Yaksa scrambling after him. As the ramp hissed shut behind them, Yaksa clutched the containment unit close, the weight of its burden settling over him like a shroud. The galaxy's fate hung in the balance, and he and Frank were the only ones standing between it and oblivion. The shuttle sliced through the jungle, plasma shells erupting all around it. Vines and branches snapped against the view screen as Frank wrenched the controls, barely staying ahead of the deluge. He slapped the throttle to full burn. The shuttle clawed for altitude, the canopy whipping past in a green blur. A shell burst starboard, peppering the hull. Frank juked hard to port, evading another blast by inches. Sweat beaded his brow as coaxed every bit of speed from the straining engines. With a bone-jarring lurch, they breached the atmosphere, Xandros's curve falling away beneath them. For an instant, the starscape yawned wide and clear. Then proximity sensors shrilled in warning. Arrayed before them, weapons hot, loomed a blockade of Zorgax's warships. Frank swore vividly. "Looks like Zorgax isn't going to let us go without a fight." His fingers flew over the console, diverting power to shields and engines. "Yaksa, man the turret. We're going to have to shoot our way through." Yaksa unclipped his harness and leapt into the gunnery chair, adrenaline sizzling through his veins. He seized the firing controls for the twin plasma cannons just as the warships opened up. Searing bolts of energy slashed past on all sides. Frank sent the shuttle into a corkscrew dive, narrowly evading the fusillade. He jinked hard right, then left, the inertial compensators straining to blunt the crushing G-forces. Yaksa swung the turret to starboard and hammered the firing studs. Brilliant lances of plasma streaked from the cannons. One found its mark, spearing an enemy frigate amidships. Geysers of flames spewed from the stricken vessel. The warships swarmed after them, filling space with arcing traceries of plasma. Frank rolled and juked, maneuvering with preternatural skill, but the shuttle was badly outgunned. A bolt clipped their aft shields, alarms shrieking. "Shields down to 50%, Yaxer yelled, talons clenched white around the controls. Frank gritted his teeth, searching desperately for an out. There, a gap in the blockade's coverage. The warship slow to adjust to the shuttle's breakneck maneuvering. He firewalled the throttle. "Hold on." The engines howled as they hurtled towards the narrow opening. The warship scrambled to reposition, but too late. The shuttle shot through the gap with inches to spare, the enemy ships receding rapidly astern. The starfield stretched before them, beckoning with the promise of escape. But Frank's eyes were locked on the scanners, a new dread welling in his gut. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said tightly. "Zorgax's flagship is in pursuit and it's gaining on us." Yaxer swiveled to face him, compound eyes bright with determination. "We can't let Zorgax get his claws on the device. We have to get it back to the Galactic Council at all costs." Frank nodded grimly, a desperate gambit taking shape in his mind. Then let's give him a target he can't resist. Frank grinned, guiding the shuttle in a hairpin turn. Thrusters screaming, they hurtled straight at Zorgax's flagship, its plasma cannons swiveling to unleash hell. "Giving Zorgax a taste of his own medicine," Frank replied, slamming the cloaking field's activation. The shuttle vanished from sight. Cannon fire lanced through the void where they'd been an instant before. Frank wove through the barrage, invisible, on a collision course with the flagship's hangar. At the last second he wrenched the stick hard. The shuttle knifed into the bay, skimming the deck. Frank slapped the hatch release and vaulted out, Yaxer on his heels. The containment unit rode snug on the kid's back. Technicians and guards swarmed the hangar, oblivious to the intruders. Frank and Yaxer ghosted through the chaos, pressed close to the bulkheads. Sidestepping a passing patrol, they slipped into a maintenance shaft. "We need to find the reactor core," Frank said, unfolding a stolen schematic. "Overload it, cripple the ship, buy time." Yaxer traced a path with a claw. "There, near the center, but the guard will be heavy." Frank smirked, cracking his knuckles. "Then we get creative." They stalked the corridors, a blur of speed and sudden violence. Sentries crumpled before they could cry out, throats crushed, windpipes collapsed. Frank flowed from one to the next, a lethal shadow. Yaxer followed, his own skills honed razor-sharp. The reactor loomed before them, a thrumming cylinder of raw power. One last obstacle blocked their path, a hulking cyborg, ocular implants glowing baleful crimson. "You've come far, humans, but this is where your journey ends," it snarled, hydraulic claws flexing. The cyborg roared, charging, claws outstretched. Frank pivoted, a matador dodging a bull. His boot hammered into the cyborg's midsection, servos squealing. It staggered, off balance. Yaxer pounced, plasma dagger flashing. He plunged it into a gap in the cyborg's carapace, shorting its systems. It toppled, jerking and sparking. Frank nodded approval, chest heaving. "Nice work, kid, now let's finish this." Frank ripped open the reactor chamber's blast door, Yaxer on his heels. The chamber pulsed with searing light, the containment field flickering. And there, standing before the reactor's control console, was Zorgax himself. The warlord turned, mandibles twisted in a vicious sneer. "You may have bested my troops, but you'll find I'm not so easily defeated." Zorgax's wrist-mounted plasma cannons whirred to life. A blistering barrage of energy bolts sizzled through the air. Frank and Yaxer dove for cover behind a bank of computers, the console buckling under the onslaught. Frank peeked around the mangled metal, assessing the chamber through the haze of ozone and sparks. There, a chink in the containment field's armor, pulsing with unstable light. A weakness. "Yaxer," Frank shouted over the shriek of plasma. "If we destabilize that containment field, the reactor core will go critical, vaporize the ship and Zorgax with it." Yaxer's compound eyes narrowed, his mind racing through the implications. He nodded grimly. "How do we get close? Zorgax has us pinned down." Frank dug into his belt pouch, producing a fist-sized metallic sphere, a plasma charge compact but powerful. "Shall draw his fire," Frank said, his voice steel. "When I give the signal, sprint for the reactor. Plant this charge, it'll punch through that field like tissue paper." Yaksa accepted the humming sphere, his claws tightening around its casing. He cycled a long breath, the weight of the mission settling on his carapace. "Ready?" Frank held up 3 fingers, 2, 1. He vaulted over the console with a roar, one hand unleashing a salvo of blaster bolts, the other whipping a flashbang grenade at Zorgax's feet. The warlord snarled, his aim faltering as searing light consumed his vision. Yaksa exploded from cover, legs pumping, the charge held tight to his thorax. He jinked and juked through the storm of plasma fire, shrapnel pinging off his exoskeleton. Reaching the containment field, he ripped open an access panel and slammed the pulsing charge into its housing. Claws flying over the keypad, he set the detonator. 30 seconds. "It's armed," Yaksa called out. He spun to see Frank and Zorgax locked in a whirlwind of striking limbs and flashing blades. For all the human skill, the warlord's sheer strength was overwhelming. Armored fists hammered Frank's guard, forcing him back. No time to hesitate. Yaksa thumbed his dagger's activation stud, the blade humming to life. He launched himself at Zorgax's flank in a blur of chitinous plates and flashing plasma. The point took Zorgax in the shoulder, punching through his pauldron. The warlord howled in pain and fury, rounding on Yaksa. But the momentary distraction was all Frank needed. A thunderbolt uppercut snapped Zorgax's head back, sending him reeling. Frank and Yaksa pressed the attack as one, forcing the warlord back towards the spasming containment field. The detonator's readout flashed angry red. 5, 4, 3. Frank snagged Yaksa by his combat harness and hurled him bodily towards the exit. "Move!" They sprinted for the blast door, the thrum of the straining reactor swelling to a hellish crescendo behind them. A wall of force and fire slammed into Frank's back, lifting him from his feet. He crashed to the deck in a tangle of limbs, Yaksa sprawling beside him. Klaxons warbled, barely audible over the roar of tortured metal and venting atmosphere. "Goes," Frank snarled, hauling Yaksa upright. "Hang her now!" They hurled themselves into the craft, Frank's fist slamming the ramp controls. As it ground shut, he threw himself into the pilot's seat, hands flying over the console. The shuttle lurched into the air, thrusters howling. Through the viewport, Zorgax's flagship bloomed into a miniature sun, the fireball consuming itself in a maelstrom of shattered metal and vaporized carbon. Frank punched the throttle, the force of the explosion buffeting the shuttle as it clawed for open space. The stars swung crazily, the inertial dampeners straining against the onslaught. Then stillness, the infinite black of the void marred only by the fading embers of Zorgax's funeral pyre. The shuttle shuddered, its hull groaning under the strain as plasma blasts hammered its shields. Frank wrenched the controls, sending the craft into a stomach-churning barrel roll. A fighter screamed past, cannons blazing. "Shields at 30%, Yaksa shouted, his claws dancing over the sparking console. "We can't take much more of this." Frank's eyes narrowed, scanning the starfield ahead. The binary stars loomed before them, a seething maelstrom of gravitational forces. One wrong move, and they'd be crushed like an empty beer can. "Hold on to your thorax, kid," Frank growled. "This is going to get hairy." He slammed the throttle forward, the engines roaring as the shuttle surged towards the stars. The fighters, caught off guard, scrambled to follow. The shuttle plunged into the star's gravity well, the hull creaking and groaning as tidal forces tugged at its seams. Frank's knuckles whitened on the controls, fighting to keep the ship steady. Behind them, the fighters began to falter. One spun out of control, its wingmate smashing into it in a burst of flame and shrapnel. Another was caught in a gravitational eddy, its hull crumpling like tin foil. Frank danced the shuttle through the maelstrom, the craft shimmying and bucking like a wild bronco. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. Beside him, Yaksa clung to his harness, his mandibles clenched tight. Tail fighter, its pilot desperate, made a kamikaze run at the shuttle. Frank juked hard to starboard, the fighter missing by inches. It vanished into the stellar inferno, atomized in an instant. The remaining fighters, finally realizing the futility of their pursuit, peeled off, fleeing back towards open space. Frank let out a whoop of triumph, punching the air. "Huh? Chew on that, you overgrown cockroaches." He pointed the shuttle's nose towards clear space, the star's gravity well falling away behind them. As they broke free of the maelstrom, Yaksa sagged back in his seat, his exoskeleton rattling. Frank chuckled, adrenaline still singing in his veins. "Stick with me, kid, this is just a typical Tuesday." Frank swiveled in his seat, fixing Yaksa with an appraising look. "Quick thinking back there with the binary stars. You've got a good head on those chitinous shoulders." Yaksa ducked his head, his antennae twitching with embarrassment. "I just remembered something from my stellar cartography classes. I never thought I'd actually put it to use." "Theory is one thing, application is another," Frank said, clapping the young Pandronian on the shoulder. "You did good, rookie." As the shuttle hurtled through hyperspace, Frank allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The Doomsday device was secure, Zorgax was space dust, and they'd lived to fight another day. But the veteran soldier knew better than to let his guard down. In his experience, victory was always fleeting. There would always be another threat, another mission, another desperate gamble. For now, though, he'd savor the win. The galaxy was safe, at least for a little while, and that was enough. Frank leaned back in his chair, letting the hum of the hyperdrive lull him into a light doze. They had a few hours before they reached the Council's headquarters, and he intended to make the most of it. Frank's lips quirked in a faint smile. The galaxy was a big, bad place, full of dangers beyond imagining, but as long as there were humans and allies like Yaksa ready to stand against the darkness, there was always hope. His eyes drifted shut, the starlines of hyperspace painting his dreams in shades of light and shadow. Beside him, Yaksa fidgeted in his seat, his claws tapping a nervous rhythm on the containment unit in his lap. The orb within pulsed with a malevolent purple light, the Doomsday device that had nearly brought the galaxy to its knees. As they descended towards the landing pad, a sea of upturned faces came into view. Council members, reporters, soldiers, all cheering and waving in a riotous display of color and sound. Frank set the shuttle down with a gentle thump, the engines whining as they powered down. He turned to Yaksa, a wry grin tugging at his lips. "Looks like we've got quite the welcoming committee. You ready for this, kid?" Yaksa took a deep breath, his mandibles flaring. "As I'll ever be, Commander." They stood together, Frank hitting the ramp controls. Hydraulics hissed as the hatch lowered, revealing a throng of ecstatic well-wishers. Camera drones buzzed and whirred, hovering like glittering insects. Frank and Yaksa strode down the ramp to a cacophony of cheers and applause. Yaksa held the containment unit high, the crowd roaring at the sight of the captured device. Frank scanned the sea of faces, his expression guarded. He had never been comfortable with adulation. The crowd parted as the council leader approached, his violet robes billowing in the wind. He was an ancient Zithorian, his lined face creased with centuries of wisdom and worry, but now his eyes shone with undisguised relief and gratitude. "Commander Simmons, Yaksa, you have done the galaxy a great service," he intoned, his voice carrying over the din. "The Doomsday device will be destroyed, and Zorgax's reign of terror is at an end." Frank stepped forward, his face somber as he handed the containment unit to the leader. The orb's light cast an eerie pall over the proceedings. "It wasn't without cost," Frank said heavily. "Many good soldiers died fighting Zorgax's forces, and there's no guarantee that another threat won't rise to take his place." Yaksa drew himself up to his full height, his exoskeleton gleaming in the sun. "But we'll be ready," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "Humans and aliens working together to protect the galaxy." The leader nodded, a faint smile playing over his wizened features. "Indeed, This mission has shown us the strength that comes from unity and understanding. We must learn from this and grow stronger together. As the council members and reporters began to disperse, the excitement of the moment fading, Frank turned to Yaksa. He clapped a hand on the young Pandronian's shoulder, chuckling. "Well, kid, you held your own out there. I guess they don't teach everything in the Galactic Academy." Yaksa ducked his head, his eyes shining with newfound respect. "And I guess humans are more than just stupid primates. I'm honored to have fought beside you, Commander Simmons." As they parted ways, Yaksa to return to his studies and Frank to his next mission, they could feel the galaxy shifting around them. Old prejudices and misconceptions crumbled, replaced by a new understanding and respect. The future, once so uncertain, now glimmered with possibility. But even in the midst of celebration, a flicker of unease shadowed Frank's thoughts. He knew all too well that the galaxy was a vast and treacherous place. For every vanquished foe, another lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike. The price of peace, he reflected grimly, was constant vigilance. His work would never truly be done. As long as innocence needed protecting, as long as the galaxy cried out for a champion, Frank would be there. He would fight, he would bleed, he would sacrifice. For that was the burden and the honor of being human in a galaxy full of danger and wonder. Frank squared his shoulders, his eyes hardening with resolve. He had a ship to prep and a mission to plan. The galaxy wasn't going to save itself. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.